Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon for what promises to be a truly exciting and fun discussion. As India heads into election gear, there couldn't be a topic more apt to discuss than crony populism. This talk is part of a new dialogue series that CPR and the Trivedi Center for Political Data at the Ashoka University, Gilles is here, Mr. Qureshi is here, who are part of the center, have launched. We launched the talk series in May with the objective of creating a platform for a sober, nuanced discussion space that actually tries to, in a sober, nuanced way, unpack the complexities of our politics as we run into what is likely to be a fairly polarizing, very unnuanced election season. This is the fourth of these talks. The first talk we had was on the Karnataka election. The second talk we had was looking at the relationship between crime, politics, and money. And so similar in some ways, there's some echoes with the conversation we're going to have today. And the third talk we had early in July was on setting a research agenda for 2019. All the videos of the talks are available on our website in case any of you are interested, as will today's. Today's talk is particularly special because Michael is here with us. Michael is a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, along with his with being a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. So we're very happy to have Michael back after a while amongst us to talk to us about some of his new work on crony populism. It's also a precursor to the big grand book launch that is to happen this evening. James Crabtree has kindly agreed to be here even to give us an advanced preview of what's going to happen later this evening. So I'm considering ourselves rather lucky and privileged to get the preview of the discussions that are going to take place this afternoon. Thank you, James, for being here. James has just published and to be launched this evening his book on the billionaire Raj. He's known to India because he was the Financial Times correspondent based in Bombay, right? And I think a lot of his book is sort of emerging out of his work during his time in Bombay. He's currently associate professor in practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. So we'll structure the conversation thus. Michael will give us his presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and James will comment, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So over to you, Michael, and thanks again to everyone for being here.
It's great to be here, and I said if you want the real fun, you come to wherever it is, wherever we're going.
Nehru Library.
Yes, where we're both going later. When Yamini and I spoke about a month ago, I said I was coming and said, come and give a talk, and I live in the US now, so you cannot not think about crony populism in the US, so I thought what I'm going to give is what I've just learned, that what I'm going to give is going to be sober and nuanced. But but it's going to no, that's right. But it's what I want to do is give if I can work this give a kind of interpretive narrative. That's the goal of this talk. I want to try to characterize crony populism, outline what can in fact. What?
You have to speak closer to them.
Oh, okay, got it. We're on. Sit down.
You'll have to, sorry.
Okay, I got to sit, sorry. I'll move here.
This is what happens when you try to go high-tech.
Oh my God, okay.
In a low-tech sort of way.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can do it sitting down. Okay, so what I want to do is also get into the developmental consequences of cronyism and populism, place India in an international context, and just begin to, I'll just touch at the end on the outlook and alternative political economy scenarios. That's not really part of the presentation. If people are interested, happy to discuss that. By way of background, I actually gave a very different version of this in the Kennedy School about a few weeks ago. People like Ricardo Hausmann, Danny Roderick, and Lant Pritchard. And they could handle the idea of cronyism having good and bad consequences. They could not handle the idea of populism having good consequences. They thought that's impossible. And there are a lot of Latinos there, and there was some context. Okay, so what I'm going to do, structurally, spend a bit of time characterizing cronyism and giving some update on that. Then I want to characterize populism. I want to argue that there is actually what you might call a political economy equilibrium, that is crony populism, and then talk about the future. So first, to motivate. I realize that this is a very particular moment since Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi are now both passed away. But I want to motivate some of the talk, give the idea that Tamil Nadu was both very much a crony populist regime in the way that I think about it, but also on some dimensions a big development success. It was a sort of political economy equilibrium for some decades, absolutely thick with cronyism, deals-based economy, with some predictability. I'm sure everyone has heard the view that Tamil firms used to have to pay off the regime, the party in power with one percentage, the party out of power with the other percentage. It's nicely a sort of probabilistic assessment of the payback. And of course, very interestingly, there was a very nice relationship between the Tamilian parties and the centre. When they acquired substantial political leverage in the centre, that became a marvellous source of extracting rents from the centre to Tamil Nadu. I'd highlight three characteristics. One, history of being anti-elite in the sense of anti-Brahmin, nativist in the sense of Dravidian, and economically nationalist in the sense of support for Tamilian capitalists. This is what, thinking about Tamil Nadu, I've always thought. But keep those three in mind. I'm going to come back to them. Why successful? Well, there was actually what economists call credible commitment for private investment. Firms were not going to, if they play the game, were not going to be expropriated. Rent sharing was aligned more or less with productive growth. We've got a very interesting case study of the auto industry, how that evolved historically and then emerged as a very important industry in Tamil Nadu and is now very much integrated into global value chains. Absolutely a sequence of productivity improvements and aligned populism in the sense that, well, yeah, people did get their televisions, but also that linked to a history of relatively good public service. This is to give us a motivation that there could be something about this which has good as well as bad sides in a context, but contingent. Now, both the great figures have passed away, and even anecdotally, I was hearing from people when Jayalalitha was in jail that the rent extraction had become more predatory. So this was a contingent equilibrium on the particular structure of relationships and processes. So first, that's context. Now I want to do a bit of characterization of cronyism. Another bit of motivation. If you just look at the correlation, this is corruption against private investment in 1998 and 2016. There's been lots of detailed analysis. No simple correlation. Often fast-growing countries, China being an extreme exemplar, are thick with corruption. So stuff, if we're interested in development and private investment and growth, it's occurring on some kind of different dimension. What are the key features of cronyism as I would characterize? State-business interrelationships, where there is creation of economic rents and a structured process of rent sharing as a mutually advantageous equilibrium that actually solves problems for each party. For business, very important, two ways of resolving problems. One, it resolves the commitment problem. If you've got where it works, where you get a functional crony capitalism. Functional I mean it works, not that it's good or bad. There is rent creation and a mutual interest in it continuing, which makes it costly for the politicians to expropriate the firm, whether that's actual full expropriation or expropriation through taxes. That's one achievement of when it works. The second is what I've loosely called regulatory support, because that hides a host of sins, from creating favoured regulation to regulatory forbearance to, as Savagati and others have done work on how all those supposed regulations, there's a lot of water under those. You get things done quickly, despite the formality, if you have the connections. For politicians, political finance as the quid pro quo for favours. Sometimes a very useful role of or favoured treatment, and that can involve actually undercutting the opposition, in addition to private gains. Economics and growth, ambiguous. Here, for those people who like graphs, look at the graph. People, if you don't like graphs, this is a heuristic graph in which, with the central idea that countries have what you might call a technical possibilities curves at a particular decade about where they may be able to get a feasible frontier of production. But in order to achieve that, you need arrangements such that private businesses can actually produce to that. Most countries fall very short of that. But the key heuristic idea of this graph is in the circumstances of most developing countries, the optimal for investment is not zero cronyism, precisely because of the weak rule of law. That these kind of rent-sharing arrangements actually solve problems and allow things to be got done. But of course, there is, again, heuristically, a peak to that, and if you have too much cronyism, it all goes into the wrong kinds of deals and it tails off. Heuristically, yes, this is, I should have said it, for those who aren't economists, what do we mean by rents? Economic rents are gains that you get from activity that are in excess of it being a situation of perfect competition or could be used in alternative uses. Very useful to recognize that rents always come from some kind of economic power, some kind of economic monopoly. That can be the economic power you get from innovation, from breaking into new markets, where you get the additional benefits to the learning, Schumpeterian progress, and so on, or it can flow from various kinds of monopoly, often created by connections with government, natural monopolies, unregulated, or favoured deals, resource allocation. You know all of those here. Now, I think an important idea is extreme wealth from corporate areas has to come some way or other from economic rents. And they could be good rents, productivity increasing rents, or they could be bad rents. And some are indeed purely extractive. Not going to go into this much here, but I think an interesting feature of the world, and when I've done work on India, is sometimes domains that seem classically bad rent thick. Construction companies are classically thick with rents. You actually get capability formation as well. We think of, we'd also done work on Andhra Pradesh, and that was a wonderfully rent-thick area for, well, the most famous are GVR and GMR, who got their deals first locally, then through the PPPs, and then above that with a very structured system of rent sharing, and built substantial capability, such that had the capacity. Same story, similar story with Adani in Gujarat, such that they then went global. And this is, I think, it's more complicated than some stuff is bad and some stuff is good. Of course, I'll come back later to the consequences for debt. But heuristics, I think of China and Korea, both spectacular development successes, as actually being countries that had tremendous possibilities for expansion and also had deals-based environments in both of them, absolutely in Korea as well as in China, which allowed them to move aggressively towards that function, function. And people working, like Ricardo Hausmann has done work looking at India's production structure in the context of global possibilities. He comes away with the view that India has fantastic possibilities because it has lots of production characteristics that are close to other possibilities on the frontier. But that's the frontier, and the big question is what's the organizational possibilities? Yes. Yes.
Are you distinguishing between cronyism and what you used to call the corporatist?
No.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah, the corporatist state would, no, it's not the same. No. Corporatist state would be the kind of the European model of structured, legalized. So, cronyism in this sense would be off the boundaries of law, would be deals. Sometimes off and sometimes within. Okay. Just a bit of context on, update on India. This is, I'm not allowed to stand up, am I? Okay. This is, okay. This is India. We see substantial growth, but still very poor relative to China, India, Mexico. This is India, this is China, this is India. Real, genuine total factor productivity growth. Unlike Mexico, that's completely stagnant. I should mention Erica Caballero helped me on this. She's Mexican, so she's looking a little not sure nostalgic is the word at this moment. But with these two are very important to the story. This is India's extraordinary private investment surge between 1980 and the boom years of the 2000s, and then a big fall and some catch up. And of course, it went very much into export markets, massive insertion into export markets, which is important when you step back to thinking this works in terms of productivity dynamics, where there's major incentives to invest and some kind of disciplining. And that disciplining can come from engagement in export markets. China's a wonderfully complicated story of links to the party. Korea also had a layer of disciplining from the bureaucracy, which, of course, India is different on that. And with a related idea, the idea of there can be very efficient plutocrats. This is Carlos Slim HÉLU, who in 2013, I think he slipped down a little bit now, he was the second richest in the world. Very interesting. His wealth was based on favored privatization from President Salinas, a sprawling conglomerate, mining, finance, industry, real estate companies, soccer clubs, I should say football clubs, as we're not in the US, with absolutely social costs for the Mexican economy. But he and his team had major improvements in efficiency of Telmex, and then went global. And this, I put this up, this should really sound familiar here. You know, the efficient plutocrat gets things done and is also a big rent extractor. Of course, who's the other guy? Bill Gates is actually kind of interesting because you think of it classically innovation rents, but then he really fought hard to preserve his monopoly in the position. Okay, Indian billionaires. You get much more fun on billionaires from James in his book and later. I started getting interested in billionaires when working on Mexico. What is partly because especially because in these countries, billionaire wealth is mainly from the corporate sector. There is some inheritance, but into corporate. It is an indicator of massive rents in the corporate sector and the valuation of those. And here what we see is this spectacular rise. This is the number. This is the total net worth. That's just the pattern over there. And one that has actually, I'm going to come back to the recent period at the end of the talk. Okay, so I want to kind of end this segment with that's the generic story. What, of course, was happening towards the end of the UPA was, I would say, going down that curve. The intensification of rent extraction, especially at the centre, I'm not sure if it changed much in the States, was a clear feature of the second UPA government. There was some riding of the growth as well, and is a very important political economy factor. That, of course, when you have cronyism and state banks, and very importantly, and this comes out very nicely from James's book, and it's been an old theme here, asymmetric power between what James nicely calls the tycoons, and the banks, for various reasons. What you get is a lot of bad lending. And the heritage of that is this extraordinary rise in non-performing assets. Of course, some of these were high before and have now been recognized. But these are really, this is a big heritage of the UPA crony capitalism and is a major burden going forward. Okay, hold that. Going to characterize populism before putting it together. So, what are key features? And here, I found there's, I think, a very nice book by Barry Eichengreen looking at the history of populism, very much in the US and Europe over the last 100 years or so. And he essentially characterizes it as having three core features, being a political movement that is anti-elite, anti-establishment, and some kind of nativist, which also means typically demonizing whatever the other happens to be, and always economically nationalist, which often means protectionist. That's, Trump is a classic in this in terms of his policies. It also has typically three other characteristics. A charismatic leader who can mobilize this, who has a kind of direct link with the people. That is often a major driver of this being successful. Authoritarian temptations, often linked with that being a charismatic leader, and often an additional dark side in terms of inhumanity and cruelty. And living in the US, and I'm from the UK, just two tragic examples of that. One was, people have been talking about the treatment of immigrants in the US, the border separations of families in the US. It's now been stopped by the courts, which are extraordinarily cruel. In the UK, there's various things, but one aspect of populist sentiment, though the UK government isn't populist, the government isn't, has been some people from the Caribbean who were invited to the US, have invited the UK, lived there all their lives, not happened into the papers, being kicked out and sent to the Caribbean. So this is, I think, a nasty dark side of these forces. I think it's useful to distinguish between populist movements. The party called the Populist in the US never got into power, but they were a very important movement. Strategies, and in the UK, the Brexiteers are very much populist in their strategies, but they're not actually running the government. From populists in government, where I think Trump is a prime case, I would characterize Modi as basically following the populist trope. What are the drivers? There's been a lot of discussion on this. And in the US and Europe, there is the common view, why is it so important there now, is the interaction between economic insecurity, some of which is really long-term, 2 or 3 decades in the United States, some is more short-term post the financial crisis, and that interacting with what people call cultural anxieties over identity. In the US, it's very much the kind of the white male who was the king of the US for in the kind of psychological narrative, and is now feeling his place as being gone. So that's the core interaction. This, I think, very much interacts with what are genuine political, institutional policy failures. The failures to respond to some of what have been the economic insecurities which were created by the particular paths and they're not dealt with, regional losses in all these countries, and then accelerated with the financial crisis. And of course, the financial crisis accelerated in these countries the kind of shift to populist sentiment, because you beautifully had, beautifully in terms of dynamics, this, the finance, the awful finance, causing the crisis, getting away with it, not going to jail, still getting their payoffs, even while everybody else was suffering. But what is really interesting is how this seems like a global phenomenon, that the kind of nature of what's going on seems to be way broader, even in lots of countries like the Philippines, like India, which are actually growing quite well. And that, I think, is something to engage with. There's something about this moment. And I'm much more speculative on this, that I would think that with all the rapid change, that also leads to rising aspirations, which people love in India. It's a good, of course, rising aspirations are a really good thing, but that actually leads to different kinds of demands, and of course, with so much change going on, so much reshuffling of society, cultural anxieties over past structures, and of course the rising aspirations interact with still pretty bleak systems for economic security, plus for a skilled political entrepreneur, populist tactics are often very attractive, because if you are skilled in that, they really often work. And maybe especially so, I mean, traditionally you'd think of India or other countries as, in terms of political strategies, much more dependent on traditional clientelistic and patronage-based techniques. And the power of those, I think, tend to go away as you get into more urbanized, less tight linkages between patrons and clients. Now, when might populism be good? Gave you an example, Tamil Nadu. When it actually really does mobilize popular movements, and that's needed, and it has to be both sufficiently inclusive and not follow the Latino model, which is goes for other reasons, which I'll touch at the very end, goes into macro crisis. And James refers to in his book something I've thought about in the part. One classic example was the populist movement in the US became transformed. It's very much, some of it was about an anti-Gilded Age robber baron motive, got transformed into the governmental and civil society progressive movement. Tamil Nadu we saw. In both of these cases, actually, the formal democratic processes are incorporated into this, and I think modify to some degree the dark side. When bad, classic literally, when it's linked to macroeconomic intemperance, can be highly inefficient, can lead to short-termism, can be exclusionary, is often exclusionary. Often the authoritarian temptation follows the populist temptation. I should say Barry Eichengreen's book is called The Populist Temptation, which I think is very nicely captures the politics. And in the extreme, and this has been both in the UK and in the US, people, including Trump himself, have used the term enemies of the people, a term beloved of people around Hitler and Stalin. They use it, I'm not sure, subconsciously channeling something dark without realizing it, or anti-nationalist here. So, a few words on crony populism. When you first think about it, it seems kind of surprising. Think populists hate elites, they hate cronies. The populist movement in the US was partly founded on attacking the Gilded Age robber barons. The India's anti-corruption movement towards the end of the UPA was very much spurred by the very high-level scams that were so central to political discourse there, at least in the quote kind of middle groups. But my thesis is that crony populism can be a political economy equilibrium. And what is striking, gives us three examples here. The US Trump is actually absolutely favoring his business colleagues. Erdogan in Turkey is very interesting. He came in the early 2000s as a kind of person of the people, moderate Islam, and anti-corruption in the system. As now he's really put everything together. Friends who work on Turkey say, well, he found out that his cronies were actually a much easier way to get his money, and he's gone down a route that is where they're the populism is a particular kind of Islamism. Hungary is a distressing case where there has been very much a kind of, quote, an authoritarian populism who's also brought his cronies into the system. Oh, I don't know what that is. Oh, yeah. So, what's the structure? The simple structure is absolutely every polity that is functional needs this relationship between politics and business. I spoke about that under cronyism. Credible commitment and regulatory support in return for political support. But it also has to have social legitimation to be functional, even most authoritarian governments. That I would characterize as a deal which, on the one hand, politicians need votes or other kinds of political support, in return of goods and services, but also in return often for the cultural recognition, affirmation of pride. The key linkages is that business plays a central role in political finance, and that dynamic is what holds the equilibrium together. Raghu Rajan had a very nice talk a few years ago, I think you referred to this, about how this equilibrium all came together, and would characterize crony populism as, there are different resolutions of this, as one quite effective resolution of these compacts, such that it can be a sustainable political equilibrium. Have I said all this? Yes, so sometimes so we see the charismatic populist leader. Economic nationalism is also aligned with populism, except for some genuinely left-wing populists. Often the pride in your capitalist is the economic is very present. Very systematically, protectionism is a common thing that populists like, but protectionism can have different forms. It's sometimes economic nationalist, and I should say that this combining pro-business and populist may sometimes be a very opportunistic strategy. The dangerous clown Boris Johnson in the UK is, I think, a vivid example, if anyone knows who he is. He is absolutely using populist techniques and totally disingenuous. Trump, I think, is actually much more complicated because he's kind of an outsider for the core business class, and he has, I think, consciously or unconsciously, brilliantly channeled the connectivity with especially the kind of white male, and some genuinely aligned. Erdogan and I think say Modi, there is a kind of ideological, psychological alignments with the views. Okay, finally, I think India's current conjuncture, and this is much more speculative, but I want to put it out, I would characterize as looking like restructured cronyism and intensified populism, with, at first sight, and this is, the general view is under the Modi government, it's been reducing cronyism, and so going down, but with also some reduction in investment. But that's, and there is clear evidence for that at one level. Absolute success in controlling ministers at the centre. That's been efficient management. That the kind of scams, the kind of transactional deals that all ministers, especially those from Tamil Nadu, very efficiently did. Those are largely gone, and with a real narrative, the GST, the doing business things, that as we know from, I had no view of that had any impact at all. The recognition of non-performing assets is very important. The bankruptcy law, all important stuff. That's the kind of narrative. State level, hard to interpret. People may have data on that. I've heard very mixed views whether it's any different. But this is I've seen different things on this. Everybody talks about a private investment chill. It's surprisingly difficult to get data on this, though this was envisaged corporate capex and as a big fall. There seems to have been a bit of a pickup this year. Other data is ambiguous. Without having done macro work on this, my view would be that I'm really surprised that India is still growing so fast. With this kind of transitional regime, and especially the debt overhang, that's really hard to work out. Of course, India being India, there's huge amounts going on. There's new IPOs, whatever, but those are hard to avoid. But the other story, the anecdotal narrative, that in the preparation for this, I couldn't get anything really concrete on that. This is much more a restructured cronyism. For the really big players, who can do often legal deals or whatever, who are absolutely in there at the top, getting the deals. And as we see, billionaire rents, total net worth did go down in 2016, and they're now really really taking off again. Anybody interested? This is the top 10. Some of those, well, these are all familiar names from read James' books on some background. With that's so my speculative view, and people here will know a lot more than me, is that there has been absolutely a reduction of the centre transactional cronyism. The states, I would be agnostic, but with this still more concentrated, efficient cronyism at the top, which is actually Pallavi Roy is one of my co-authors. That's absolutely how she characterizes Gujarat, as kind of efficient, managed, centralized that's that story. With the populism, the seemingly to intensify, there's a lot of discussion when Prime Minister Modi came in on the balance between the development and the more Hindutva. This, of course, the Hindutva is, of course, I would just say it's an Indian version of a classic mix. There's nothing kind of special about this. The group changes across country, but it's a classic mix. And of course, we've seen many populist tendencies. The most vivid one of that, of course, is the demonetization, which I would characterize as fundamentally a populist move, with secondarily about political finance. And how does this look? And there's one other dimension I want to leave you with, that as you go more to what you might call managed, legalized cronyism, that's much more like the US model. And one historical anecdote that I like is, in the Gilded Age, the railway barons were the ones who were extracting all the rents, building the railways, then managing to get away, putting all the losses on their bondholders, and it was actually very inefficient to build the railways. That was also the industry that created the lobby industry. And of course, the lobby industry in the US, extraordinarily efficient. It's legalized cronyism. The other feature now is, to the extent that there has been this centralization and management, especially of the really big rents, in a more legalized way, that creates asymmetries in political finance. So it's like another, I would see it as another part of the kind of like the demonetization, one side of the demonetization effort, that to the extent that the big businesses can legally, increasingly, especially with these new techniques, be channeling money into the BJP. And it's tougher to use the old kind of deals making to get political finance for opposition parties. That creates an asymmetry. And again, some commentators argue that that has led to, at the state level, the political finance going more into predatory rent extraction. And this is more speculative, but my co-author Pallavi Roy considers some of the West Bengal syndicate Raj as not just something that happened in West Bengal, but partly endogenous to this asymmetry in political finance. Okay, I'm going to jump to final thought, which is where might this go in terms of dynamics? And this is 3 heuristic scenarios. We may want to talk about them. Here we have a crony populist resolution. One path, the middle path, is that it continues to be highly functional in the sense of it works. And there is a consolidation, increased, which may go with increased closing of civil society, more authoritarianism, and overlaid possibly deepening polarization. That's one scenario. Another scenario I would characterize as the Latin Americanization, where India increasingly looking like a Latin American country. The Latin American style, when the inequality is created, tends to cycle to and fro between quote right and quote left. It's unstable in the long run. It's part of productivity problems. And then every 10 years have a good macro crisis. Now, India, for a lot of structural reasons, all the debt is largely internal. Many reasons why it hasn't spilled over into a currency crisis since '91, but that is something that could brew. And if pressures intensify, the temptation to spend on the fiscus or push on the banks rises. The final one, and James also refers to it at the end of his book, is the scenario in which I'd like to put it that the populist energy gets broadened and metabolized into a 21st century social democracy. And I use those terms deliberately on the potential endpoint. Even though social democracy has lots of connotations, I find it hard to think of a sustainable political structure that does not effectively do what social democracy was trying to do. By the way, a few years ago, I was in a very different panel on the future of social democracy that Sonia Gandhi was chairing when there was debates on this in the, I guess it was the Rajiv. No, it wasn't that. It was some other. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And there, the really interesting parallel at that point was why in the 30s, as a response to the distributional fights that were occurring throughout the world at that point, there were two political economy resolutions. One was the social economy one, and the other was the fascist one. Which I'm not suggesting that's a resolution, but I'm suggesting that here there are these forces that do require resolution. I'm actually, when I was looking at the parallel a year or two ago, I don't think that India's quote populist movements, especially around, has the characteristics to do this transformation at this point, to engage with government, have a broader, but that is a potential path to explore. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you. So this is my contribution to this debate. And when I told my agent in London that I was thinking about this, and I said I was going to try and do something that was pretty radical, path-breaking, never really been done before, which was to write a book about India as a white British male journalist, of which you will know that there are quite a few. And looking at this panel around me, I see two Brits and a Frenchman, and I'm sort of wondering how we've come to be here. But I for one, am enormously grateful for this white British non-journalist, because in a sense, my book is a kind of collation of the wisdom of the clever people I was able to befriend and get to know, some of whom, we have the ghost of Pratap Banu Mehta being one of them, people like Gilles, researchers, academics, people who actually knew what they were talking about as opposed to sort of journalists like me. And Michael's work, particularly on this core area of the themes of the book that I've written about the super rich, crony capitalism, and the boom and bust model in India's economy, Michael's work was really foundational to that. Now, he wrote an article, in that widely read and totemically influential publication, EPW, and when something goes out in EPW, everybody listens. But he wrote the first piece trying to piece together data on India's billionaires and where they made their money in 2012, 13, I don't know. And I remember I've been sort of interested in this but there was nobody who was writing about it. There was no sort of data. You could look at the Forbes list. And so Michael was the first one who went out and actually got some data and then found a way, in a sort of relatively rough and ready way, of taking these billionaires and categorizing them into sectors that were thick with rents, as you explain, and those that were not. And you know, these are not sort of perfect pieces of work sometimes, but it was a huge step forward in my understanding and for the other people who are thinking about this. And it's a sort of example of where you have a thing that everybody sort of has this feeling that there's something going on with the Indian super rich, but it actually takes a researcher to come along and put some things into an Excel sheet and sort of sit there kind of stewing, and then, you know, chancellors like me can come along and steal it and write articles about it. But Michael did a huge amount of good. And so I'm delighted to be here with him because I owe him a great deal, and he's a character in the book. One of the nice things about this book is that there were people whose stories, as a storyteller as opposed to a researcher fundamentally, there were people who I met who I just thought had interesting stories, and some of them were, you know, Vijay Mallya or Naveen Jindal, but some of them, in a sense, the real good guys in the book are the Raghuram Rajans or Ashish Gupta, the gentleman at Credit Suisse who first discovered the bad loan problem, or people like Michael, who has an interesting story for the way that he lived in Mexico. And your wife was at the World Bank, you moved to Delhi, you had this experience in Mexico, which is a sort of outright crony economy. You move here, you see things in India because you lived in Mexico. And in a sense, it's only sort of three pages or something of Michael's story. But I found that very instructive, that in a sense you learn from the crony experiences of other countries. You don't have a parochial debate about your own economy. You look at Mexico, you look at South Korea, you look at Thailand, and you think, so how are we different and how are we the same? And so anyway, that's enough buttering up of Michael. Let me sort of say three things. And should I go for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes? What do you want? 10 minutes, okay. So three things.
Four things.
I will do 4 things, yeah, because I do have a concluding point. So the first is I wrote a piece in the Hindustan Times today, which had been kind of on my mind for a while, the headline of which is, Does India Need More Corruption? And it was inspired by the wonderfully lunatic Edvard Luttwak. Do you know Luttwak? Sort of mad kind of right-wing geopolitical analyst who once wrote a rather splendid article called Why You Need More Fraud, Waste and Abuse at the Pentagon. Namely that things that you think are terrible often have quite positive effects within institutions or economies. And that's true with corruption under certain senses. I mean, there are very few things that unite Indian politics, but one of the few dividing lines is everyone thinks corruption is bad. But A, from the academic literature, or B, with a moment's thought, you realize that actually corruption isn't bad. There's all sorts of good things about corruption. There's a reason why people do this. It's not a kind of malevolent phenomenon. And that's what Michael's talking about in his work. And I suppose I've been thinking about this. I had a conversation with Arvind Subramanian when he was still the chief economic advisor, where we sort of tried to, I remember hashing this out in his office, and he was pondering being a little bit brave and putting something about the potential economic benefits of corruption in one of his annual reports. Obviously, I think he saw the risk of that and decided not to do it. But I kept sort of thinking about this, and there's an interesting literature on whether, quite well sort of passed through, as to whether or not corruption greases the wheels in the world that came from sort of Samuel Huntington, but lots of people have done studies on this. Does it help unblock problems? Is it a commitment device? Does it show that if you're willing to pay a bribe, you'll actually do what you say you're going to do? Does it circumvent bureaucratic hurdles? All of you who've had to pay bribes to get something done know that there's a sort of, it helps in some ways. Or does it throw sand in the wheels? And in particular in this question, the question is it growth enhancing under certain conditions? And this is the example of China, Southeast Asia and East Asia, where all of the successful economies that we know that have gone from poverty to middle income status to something approaching the rich world, so Malaysia and China are just on that threshold, and then there's 5 or 6 others that have made it and then some. They were all rampantly corrupt at one stage or another. But what they were able to do was, in some circumstances, they had a kind of form of strategic rent-seeking. Joe Studwell, if you want a kind of populist introduction to this, his book, How Asia Works, gives a kind of magnificently clear example of this, that in the process of taking tens of millions, in the case of China and India, hundreds of millions of people off the fields, in export-focused manufacturing, and then onwards up the value chain, which is the only way outside of oil emirates that we know that countries can become rich in a hurry, which is the East Asian model. All of them had a kind of form of strategic rent-seeking, which is that the political elites would allow the business elites, so the collusion between the elites, they'd allow you to take something under the table as long as you did what they wanted to do, what you wanted to do. And what they wanted you to do was build infrastructure, develop export-focused manufacturing, and to some degree begin the provision of sort of public services, some of which were contracted out. And so we'll get on to Tamil Nadu and Andhra, which are the purest examples of this in India. And it works. It's very effective. Now, so the argument that I made in the Hindustan Times is there a case to be made, all other things being equal, that actually India could do with a bit of this? Because you've got the data there. Actually, it's quite easy to get data on there. I'll send some of you on the kind of private investment crunch. If you look at new project creation, you look at capital deepening, on all of these measures, India's, the buccaneering tycoons of the billionaire Raj, with the exception of one in particular, who's still quite bold and brave. Most of them have effectively gone on strike in the aftermath of the season of scams and the breakdown in the old model of investment in India. The way I think about this is you had an old world before 1991 and to some degree until the mid-2000s that you could think of as capital was expensive, but politics was easy. So it's very, very difficult to raise money, but quite easy to kind of get things done in the political system. And we're now, and from the mid-2000s, that flipped completely, and particularly now. So capital is relatively cheaper in India than it has ever been before, and it was particularly so in the boom years where you could raise all sorts of money very quickly. That's what the billionaires became good at. In a sense, they were quite good at building things, but they were really good at raising money, often in a way that was rather unscrupulous. But they weren't entirely building it to sort of just put it in their pockets and put it in Swiss bank accounts. This wasn't African kleptocracy. They were borrowing to invest in things that they wanted to invest in and making sure that they padded their returns along the way. But it was around that same time that the politics got very difficult. The political way you used to navigate the system all broke down because of the focus that came about on corruption. And that's still the world that we're living in. Capital is still relatively easily available at this moment in time, and Indian politics is very, very difficult. The old investment model is broken, and there is no new one to replace it. Modi has not fixed that. He's made a reasonable fist of trying to fix the problems in the corporate sector. Their efforts on the banking side have been worse than useless, and the state of the Indian banking system is much worse than it was. It's now becoming so parlous, it's almost difficult to see, in theory, how you're going to fix it. It's really very dangerous indeed. And so the question is, would a little bit of corruption help? Because it would allow the tycoons to get a better return. And I've been sort of thinking about this. I've been trying to work out. I was hoping that the answer would be no, but it may be that the answer is yes. And actually, I found some research by an academic. So you said there was no first-order link between corruption and growth, but there's an Indian academic called Shrabani Sahar at Lincoln University who's just done a whole set of studies where the data seems to say that the differences between very autocratic or somewhat autocratic regimes and democratic regimes, and the growth-enhancing corruption works quite well in autocratic regimes. So that takes you from Malaysia to China, but it works much less well in democratic regimes. And that, in a sense, you got it exactly right. So her research suggests the issue is commitment. Can you credibly commit to do what an industrialist thinks they need to do? And in a democratic regime, be that an African country or a South Asian country, it's quite hard because these guys get turfed out of power. They sort of think they want to do it, but then they can't. Sorry, my hands are tied. And so there is no ability to credibly commit to allowing you to create and share rents in the way that you could in East Asia. And in addition to the huge scrutiny, the risk that would have to be taken at the national level in particular to kind of try and do this, which I don't think anyone would really want to do, there is at least a good theoretical reason that in a democracy like India, it probably wouldn't be very effective if you wanted to try and do this. But I think it's a debate you have to take much more seriously. So that's sort of point one. I have found a way of concluding that more corruption in India would not be a good idea, but I think you have to give an account of why corruption is good and bad, and in this particular circumstance, why it might not be a good idea to allow a bit more strategic rent-seeking, have governance problems, but get done the investment in infrastructure and basic public services. And that takes you on to your two examples, so Tamil Nadu and Andhra. Perfect examples of this in a number of different ways. So, Jayalalitha, as you say, was clearly a kind of rampant populist. I never managed to go and talk to her. Unfortunately, she's one of the big regrets of the book. She never would meet any Western journalist, and almost no journalist at all. I mean, she was at once a sort. She was. Many of you will have been down there. She was unavoidable in all walks of life, but also a recluse, which is a kind of weird compromise. You mentioned Boris Johnson. Your characterization is entirely right. The man is a complete scoundrel and opportunist. He likes to talk in the Brexit negotiations of having your cake and eating it. In the book, I quote Devesh Kapoor, who'll be very well known to most of you in this room, of talking about the distinction between the kind of cronyism of North India and cronyism of Southern India. That Southern India, moving Kerala to one side, but the other four southern states, created a system in which you could you took some of the cake, but you expanded the cake at the same time. And Northern cronyism was just eat all the cake. So there was no cake left for anybody. I also had this described as the difference between Mansur Olson's image of the roving bandit and the stationary thief in economic theory, the sort of developmental theory that governance became less extractive when you could no longer kind of roam around just looting things. You had to stay in one place. And in a sense, that also is the difference between the political classes of the North and the South. And it's pretty clear that whether you look at infrastructure creation, public good delivery, that, Tamil Nadu has a pretty good record. It looks much more like a Southeast Asian economy. And that's because it is the one that came closest to following a Southeast Asian model. And so I think your point is an interesting one, which is there is an ambiguous relationship between rent creation and rent extraction and economic development and the development indicators that come with that I think we need to grapple with. And Andhra is an even more interesting example because that's the purest and most sort of distilled form of Indian cronyism, particularly because it's the one, if you take, Michael had a slightly more long-winded definition. My definition of cronyism is collusion between the elites, the business and political elites, which I take from Min Shin Pei, the Chinese scholar, and this is just shorter, but it's basically the same as yours. Yours is cleverer and has more caveats. And Andhra has the purest form of collusion because all the business people and the politicians all come from two castes. In a sense, they normally have family on both sides of the deal. You've got the political family, the cousin will be heading the infrastructure conglomerate. The caste issue, or the kind of communal kin issue, is interesting because it tells you something about the risks involved in cronyism. This is not it's a very risky thing. If you get caught out in a very public way, you could get into trouble. You need trust in some sense. And so the fact that you are a Kaman or a Reddy provides you with a level of trust which just is another greases the wheel opposition. And what happened in particular in the mid-2000s, which is where my book deals with and where Michael's research is coming from, is instead of cronyism being it became much more entrepreneurial in the sense that people realized that what they wanted to do was not simply take a little cut on the side, they wanted to own the whole thing. So if you were going to spend crores and crores on a new irrigation system, you wanted to have the money coming in on the government side, but you also wanted to have the money coming in on the business side, and so you had a kind of perfect collusive model in Andhra, which again, it worked pretty well. I mean, rampant corruption under YSR, but it's a kind of, we'll take our 5% and then the thing will get done kind of corruption. And so, can you bring up your Modi slide? I thought that was really interesting. The one with the curvy graph and India going back to the left, as it were. I mean, if the question is, you want to kind of at some point get to well, anyway, you know the one I meant. It was the sort of the frowny smile with the arrow saying that what happened under Modi is you'd sort of slid down back towards the origin, as it were. And I presume what we're suggesting using that graph is that you want to get over the hump and down the other side, and that's your sort of route. Don't worry about it, Michael. I think people can picture it in their heads. You want to get over the hump and down the other side. And I suppose the question is, if you're either at the national government or in one of these state governments, how do you begin to, so if you're here, and you posit, sounds reasonable, that what Modi has done, he's read the Riot Act to his ministers, and they're sort of sliding back. But what you really need to do is get over the hump and sort of, there you have sort of Denmark and Singapore on the kind of far end there with sort of great governance and good investment.
Maybe here.
What's that? Okay, well, so yeah, you get further towards the frontier. And I suppose the question is, what sort of mixture of policies and what sort of mixture of rent-seeking and rent creation is going to get you there? And you touched on the end, this is my final point, and I'll be quiet, which is this sort of the issue of political finance. Because in the end, you like to talk about kind of equilibria, and there's a certain equilibria that you get in the southern states that is hard to get out of because of the way in which this kind of rent-seeking economy creates very, very expensive politics. So by repute, Andhra has the most expensive elections in the country, followed in all of the southern states, again apart from Kerala, have the most expensive elections. If you go to Bihar and UP, I mean, these have enormous, Gilles is the great expert here and may correct me, but my understanding has always been, to the extent you can ever understand this murky world, the political economy of elections there is much less expensive because there's just much less money to go round. And what happened in Andhra in particular was the part of the reason why you had this economy created in the first place and why the Andhrapreneurs, as they call them, became so inventive was they needed money to fight elections. And this becomes a kind of a total arms race that, if one party is spending, however much, then you have to do that, and you want to keep and hold power because the returns to holding power in terms of what can be extracted are going up as the economy grows. And what you get is this kind of bad equilibrium of very, very expensive politics, totally untransparent, in which we know theoretically who's funding the political parties, because, if you're talking in hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars, there's only one place that sort of money can come from, but we don't know who's giving it and to whom and on what kind of level of quid pro quo. And I suppose so there's sort of two questions that come out of that. How do you break out of that high equilibrium of very untransparent, very, very expensive politics and try and get to some other equilibrium? My sense is the only possible option for India is really to kind of go down the American route, which is just to take it on the chin and admit that you're going to have super expensive politics, but make it transparent. At least so the American system is not ideal, but I think the notion that India is going to be able to create a kind of Belgium sort of system of political funding with sort of well adhered to caps and some form of state funding and then a moderate level of kind of like small nations, it sort of seems completely impossible that is going to happen from where we are now. So let's say, okay, well, there we are. Maybe whoever you think, the Swedish system, whatever you think is the good system, which I presume perhaps rather snobbishly to be a European system, but maybe not. Maybe it's Singapore or whatever. Not Singapore. There's only one party. Yeah. Well, how do you get to a different equilibrium? And what's the sort of, because in the end, so much of this comes down to the political funding system. It's the sort of original sin of Indian democracy. And if you want to have an answer to how you get over the hump and down towards a better place with better governance, then somehow you've got to grapple with this. I'm not sure I know what the answer to that is, but I think that's a reasonable question for us to ask. Thank you.
Thank you.